I know. I said that we were going to do all gothic horror for the month of October, and I lied. Now you know I'm a liar. I just changed my mind, okay? I read this book. I have been trying recently to read more for fun, and so I read this book called The Land So Wide. It was supposed to be for fun. It was not supposed to be for content. But unfortunately, I had a really fun time with it, and it was a really great read. It was sent to me by Aardvark. Shout out Aardvark Book Club, and I want to talk about it. So that's what we're going to do today. But it is a cozy fall read. It is great for Halloween time, so I don't want to hear it. I want to be very clear here up front that I do not think this book is perfect. In fact, I have a pretty major critique for it. However, it was such a unique reading experience for me that I did just really, really enjoy it, and I ended up giving it a 5 stars anyway, even though I don't think it's perfect, because there's also no such thing as a completely perfect book. A book might be perfect for you, but that doesn't make it perfect. But the reason I wanted to make a video about it is because both what I liked about it and my one big critique for it, I just think make such interesting conversation about the craft of writing in general, and that's what this whole channel is supposed to be about. I actually don't have the book physically with me because almost immediately upon finishing it, I gave it to my mom because I thought she would really like it. So I'm sorry I don't have a physical visual, but I promise I read it. We're gonna start with no spoilers, and then I'm gonna give actually a soft spoiler warning, and then we'll get into real spoilers. So there's kind of gonna be 3 phases of this video. But the elevator pitch of this book is that it is mesh of a bunch of different genres in a way that's really, really cool and very fun. It very much, especially in the beginning, has a feel of a small town mystery where it's like there's something up with this town and I don't know what it is, but there's something here and there's all these clues being dropped in, and we, the reader, as well as the character, are trying to figure it out. But there's this element of magical realism where it's very obvious right away that there is an element of the supernatural here. So there's something up with this town, but it's not a run-of-the-mill human issue. There's something up with this town and it's something supernatural. There's a lot of, I don't know if you would call it magical realism or if you would just call it soft magic, but this isn't really a hard magic fantasy book, which is why I'm avoiding calling it a fantasy, because if you like the genre fantasy, this book is very different from a lot of other fantasies in that for a lot of the story, things aren't really explicitly explained, where it's like, hey, this is the magic, this is where it comes from, this is how it works, this is what's going on. It more just plops you into the middle of the narrative with a character to which all of this is normal. So they're not flagging these things as weird, but we, the reader, are noticing what the differences are between this town and our world, and are noticing this element of the supernatural. Really, the only thing that I can tell you without, I think, there being some spoilers is that the town has these warding stones around it that protect it against these monsters in the area called Bright-Eyes, but anybody who stays a night in Mistaken once is stuck there for the rest of their lives. And you can leave the warding stones during the day, but at night, if you don't get back to the town, you will be sucked back by the warding stones, and it doesn't really matter what's in the way. So people have died in this way, where they got sucked back to the warding stones because night fell, and they hit a tree or something on the way. But the warding stones keep out these monsters called the Bright-Eyes, and so while you're in Mistaken, you're safe from these monsters that have terrorized basically every other town in this area. And the town exists because there are these trees, they're called the Red Caps. Now, I will admit to you, I'm not much of a tree expert. And I will say, knowledge of trees was not necessary to understand the narrative. However, it is still unclear to me whether or not the red caps are supposed to be maple trees or not. I think they're fictional trees. I do at this point in time believe them to be fictional trees that have red leaves year round. It is entirely possible that the story just takes place during fall, and so the leaves are red because the maple leaves have turned. But the settlers there call them red caps, and they are this amazing tree for furniture. That was why the settlement came there in the first place, was in order to cut down these trees and mill them and try to make a fortune selling the wood from these red caps. But everybody who lives in this village is trapped there. The surrounding villages don't have warding stones, and the warding stones were put there by this thing called the benevolence that they worship. And it's the benevolence that protects them from the Bright-Eyes. Now, all of this is introduced pretty quickly to us, the reader, as well as our main character, Greer Mackenzie, who is the daughter of the guy who owns the mill. So she is from the wealthiest family in the town, but nobody's really that well off. And it also takes place sometime in like the 1700s sort of era. Technology isn't really that advanced. There's a few facts you need to know about Greer right away. First is that she's got wanderlust, okay? She wants to explore, but she's obviously stuck in Mistaken because she has to go back there every night. So she can only go as far outside Mistaken as she can get to and then get back in time to be there at night. But she's become obsessed with making maps and has started to map out the area around Mistaken the best that she can. And she's a very good cartographer. And she's also in love with a boy named Ellis. And that's where our romance element comes into play. I mentioned the words magical realism. I also mentioned the word soft magic. It's whatever way you want to look at it, but it's also a romance, but it's also a mystery. And it's really fun. However, part of my criticism is that I think that there's an element of fusing those genres together that I think got a little bit missed or misplaced. What is unique about this book is also a little bit what shot it in the foot towards the end. And that's part of why I thought it would be such an interesting topic for a video. But I ultimately really enjoyed my read of it. I did give it a 5 stars. I do recommend it. It's very unique. It's very fun. But what makes it unique and fun made it a really tough delivery. And I think that some of the delivery didn't quite land towards the end. So just keep that in mind. So this is where we're going to get into what I'm calling soft spoilers. Now you may be wondering, Meredith, you gave us the setting, but you didn't tell us the whole premise because usually there's some kind of inciting incident that sets off the narrative. Here's the problem, okay? Do not read the inside flap if you are going to read this book. Do not read what would be listed on the back of the paperback. Do not read the blurb. The inciting incident that is listed on the inside flap does not happen until, I'm not joking, halfway through the book. It is such a spoiler, in my opinion. I found myself very frustrated in the marketing of this book. I'm very surprised that they included that as the inciting incident. I'm not going to do that to you. That's where I was like, I'm going to give a soft spoiler warning before I tell you what the inciting incident is, because I genuinely think the read is better not knowing that. If you're already hooked, if you already want to read it, click out now. I think that would make a better reading experience. If you want to know what the inciting incident is to decide if you want to read it or not, let me just tell you that that incident doesn't happen until about halfway through, so it's a spoiler a little bit. But the inciting incident listed on the flap is Greer Mackenzie is in love with this guy Ellis, and at some point he leaves. He leaves the town, he disappears, and she has no idea why, and so she follows him into the woods to figure it out. And that leads her not just to try and figure out where he went, but the origins of the town and what these monsters are and different things like that. Again, not joking. The first half takes place in the town Mistaken, and the second half takes place in the wilds after Greer follows Ellis into the woods, which is what is listed as the inciting incident. Listen, I know that marketing a book isn't easy, and I know you have to convince people to read it, and just being like, hey, there's this weird town might be kind of hard to suck people in, but I do feel like there's a way they could have done it that would have still pulled in readers and made them want to read it, especially because the author, Erin A. Craig, I just realized I haven't said her name up to now. Shout out Erin A. Craig. The author is an established author. She's written other works. They're all young adult. This is her debut adult novel, but she's written other books and has a following already. There's less pressure on the marketing of this book because people already like this author. So I was just really confused by that choice and somewhat frustrated by it. So that's the premise, that's the setting. So anyway, with all of that, we are going to dive into full spoilers, and I'm going to start describing the plot to you guys. We're going to go super in depth, and I'm going to explain exactly what I loved about it and exactly what I didn't love about it. So as I've already mentioned, the beginning of the story very much has a small town mystery kind of vibe. It did a really good job of plopping us into this town and into this perspective of Greer, who's lived in this town her whole life, and having her go about her day in a way that didn't feel forced, didn't feel over-explained, but slowly but surely exposed you to exactly what is strange and supernatural about this town. Just to recap, there's this being or set of beings called the Benevolence that put up these warding stones that protect them from the Bright-Eyes, which are these vicious monsters that have destroyed other towns in the area and killed other people who have wandered out into the woods. But the warding stones protect them from that, but their sacrifice is that they always have to return back to Mistaken at night. And once you spend one night there, you're stuck there forever, or you get dragged back by the warding stones. And usually that means you die because you'll hit something on your way. Every year they do this harvest thing. I forget what the name of it is, and I gave the book to my mom. I apologize, so I couldn't double check. They're raised to be very grateful to the benevolence for putting up these warding stones, and they're always giving gifts to the benevolence and putting animal entrails out. Like if you go out and you hunt a rabbit per se, that you might take some of the entrails and leave them there for the benevolence and take the rabbit back to Mistaken. So the benevolence is introduced to us as this benevolent deity, almost sort of religion that they worship, but there is this edge to it where it's like we have to worship the benevolence because they put up these warding stones because they chose Mistaken to be safe against these bright-eyed monsters, and if we don't worship them properly, they might take away that safety. So Greer is very, very afraid of angering the benevolence, and in the opening chapter, her friend kind of scoffs at them, and it really upsets her. In the following chapters, we're introduced to her dad, who owns the mill. Her mother is dead, but she and her mother both were a little bit strange. Her mom was always able to see things that were really far away and hear things sometimes, and Greer specifically has this very bizarre superhuman hearing. I'll note a quick aside here that especially in this first part, I really loved Greer's superhuman hearing. I loved how important it was to the plot. I loved how worked in it was to her character. I loved all the different ways it was explored. I felt like it was really built out as just a pivotal piece of her where, you know, sometimes characters are introduced and they have certain powers and then they only really pop up when they're relevant. And at the very least in the first part, I didn't feel like that was the case. That maybe changes later. I felt like especially in this part one, it was such a great example of something unique about a person being worked so well into their character and into the plot. They also do this thing called the hunt, which is how they pair people up for couples. And it's eventually explained to us that because it is such a small settlement and because a lot of people don't choose to stay overnight because then they're going to be stuck there forever, the settlement has stayed very small. And as a result, there aren't always enough women for all of the men. It's specifically described this way, which I thought was really interesting, but there aren't enough women for the men. And so instead of creating a bunch of fighting over couples, they came up with this thing called the hunt. It's one day that happens every 7 years and women hide and the men of the town go around and hunt for women and choose one, and when they find one, then that woman gets married. It seems as though there isn't really a way out of getting married for the women. And in fact, Greer mentions in passing that every hunt, it feels like there's at least one woman that doesn't want to get married, doesn't want to participate in the hunt, gets really upset about it, and decides to run off into the woods instead of staying. And because the hunt happens during the day, they're totally able to leave, but presumably they got sucked back at night and killed or eaten by a bright-eyes or something like that, and that those women chose death over entering this marriage hunt thing. But Greer's not going to be put in that position because she is madly in love with Ellis and he's madly in love with her, and they've got a whole plan for him to find her during the hunt, and they're going to get married and everything's going to be great. But her dad really wants her to be with this other guy whose name I forget. It starts with an L. I'm going to call him Lawrence. I don't think that's 100% correct. But again, I gave my book to my mom, so I couldn't double check. I apologize. For our purposes, Lawrence is the guy that her dad wants her to be with because he wants that guy to inherit the mill instead of Ellis. Ellis is from the family that is the descendants of the original guy who started the settlement. The people in the town, as much as they're grateful for the fact that they're safe from the bright-eyes, a lot of them do somewhat resent being stuck there. And there is this, oh, the original guy who settled us here cursed us sort of energy that makes his descendants somewhat ostracized in the town. And so her dad, for that reason, doesn't want her to be with Ellis. He wants him to be with, again, I'm just calling him Lawrence. But Greer is like, well, my dad doesn't have any power over what actually happens during the hunt, and the hunt is final, so as long as Ellis finds me during the hunt, we're gonna be fine. But they have like a month or two before the hunt is supposed to happen. And then there's this random incident that I honestly think could have been the inciting incident. I'm over it, I'm not gonna bring it up again, where some of the warding stones moved. The warding stones have been there for generations upon generations. They've been there hundreds of years. They've never moved. And then all of a sudden, one night randomly, they scooch in, and as a result, they wipe out essentially an entire family and a bunch of livestock. When the warding stones got moved in, they got moved in super suddenly and pretty far. So then this family whose house was, I guess, near the warding stones ended up being on the other side of them when they moved. And because they moved so suddenly, they then were sucked to the warding stones. And as I've already mentioned, when that happens, you're just run into whatever's in your way. So instead of them being teleported to the warding stones, their bodies were bumped into trees and rocks and the house and anything that was in between. And so the entire family dies, as does their entire flock of livestock. It's really gruesome. This is probably the most gruesome scene in the entire book. It's not over the top. I'm pretty sensitive to gore and body horror kind of stuff, and I was totally able to read it. If you're into that sort of thing, then you'd probably think I was a baby reading this book, and you'd be like, dude, this wasn't gory at all. But that was the scene that got me a little bit in the way that it was described. So then the whole town's like, what the hell? And as they're trying to figure out what's going on, a bunch of bugs descend. And as they're trying to get rid of the bugs, I believe they were moths, then a bunch of bats descend. And it's this very religious, you pissed off your gods sort of feel. And everybody in the town assumes that the benevolence is mad at them for something. And that's why they moved the stones. And that's why there were the moths and then the bats. And this is a very horrific experience for everybody involved. When Greer gets home, before any of the rest of her family is home, she finds this note stabbed to their front door with a knife, and when she tries to pull the knife out of the door to get the note, she can't. And by the time her dad gets home, he pulls the knife out, grabs the note, and won't let her see what's written on it, and she only gets a few scraps of words, and one of them is boy. This causes them to move up their big harvest celebration thing and also move up the hunt, because the hunt usually happens the morning after the big harvest. So Greer obviously is pretty heartbroken over this family dying, and she's pretty confused that all of this is happening, and in the back of her mind, she is wondering if it's because her friend scoffed at the benevolence and if they're angry because of that. But they go through their whole harvest, they put out all the food, and Greer starts to, I forget if it's in this scene or it might be the scene beforehand, where she starts to hear somebody calling to her and saying, come find me. She has a superhuman hearing, so she's trying to figure out who's saying it and why they're saying it, and she wonders if they're the benevolence, and then she wonders if they're the bright-eyeds, and that continues from then until when she leaves the town and then even afterwards. But all of that to say that they're hoping that by moving up this harvest, they'll be able to please the benevolence and stop all of this craziness from happening. And then when the hunt comes, Greer hides and she waits to be found by Ellis, but she waits there all day and he never comes and finds her, and she's really confused. And then Lawrence comes and finds her instead, and he's like, ha, I caught you and the hunt is final. You're my wife now. He sucks. I hate him. And when she looks over, she sees Ellis wave to her and then leave beyond the stone. Greer is absolutely distraught about this. She's convinced her dad had something to do with it. She has no idea why Ellis betrayed her, why he would choose to leave, and she watches a bright-eyed follow him. At this point in time, we haven't gotten that in-depth a description of the bright-eyeds, and all of the descriptions of them, they do incite a little bit of fear, but they aren't clear enough for you to get a visual, and that is on purpose. And that is one of the things that's pretty cool about this book, and it's something that I liked. So I wanted to make sure I mentioned it. That at this point in time, that Greer sees a bright-eyed and sees it following Ellis, but we don't really know what it looks like yet. She's very distraught. She's convinced her dad has something to do with it. Her dad basically takes her and locks her in his office and tells her that it's for the best and that Ellis chose this and that she's going to marry Lawrence and it's going to be fine and she'll see that that's what's best for her and whatever. Usually they do the marriage the same day, but for some reason they decided to push it to the next day, maybe because Greer was so distraught. But there are other couples that are going to get married too, and it's one big wedding ceremony. And while she's locked in her dad's office, she realizes that her friend broke into the house. Her friend is Ellis's sister, by the way. I don't know if I mentioned that. They're brother and sister. And so her friend breaks in and she knows that her friend is there, but her dad doesn't know that. So she says something about running off into the woods to find Ellis and to save him. And she hopes that his sister picks up on her subtext and brings her some supplies and stuff like that, because she's not really going to be able to gather them herself. And then either before her dad comes in to talk to her or after, I honestly don't remember, she finds this box that's hidden really well in his office that has this list of names on it, that when she gets to the end of them, she starts to recognize a few of them and realizes that they're all women that have left during the hunt, who have refused to partake in the hunt itself. And then the final name on the list is Ellis. And she's like, wait, what the hell? And in the same box are these necklaces that are made of the same glowing stones that the warding stones are. The whole scene of her leaving is very dramatic. Ellis's sister does bring her a pack, and then her and his other sister make a whole scene to make it so that she can escape. And then Lawrence is chasing after her. Her dad is chasing after her. And she gets outside the warding stones, but it's about to be dusk. And so Lawrence is trying to drag her back, and he's like, what are you trying to get us killed? And she turns around and she screams at him. For reasons she doesn't know, we don't know, nobody knows at this point in time. Her scream is almost like a tangible thing, and when she screams at him, she actually sends him flying backwards. And way later in the narrative, we do find out that she did kill him, and so he isn't able to drag her back to the warding stones, and she sees her dad stuck on the other side of the stones because dusk has fallen. She sees Lawrence laying right outside the stones, and she realizes she didn't get stuck back. She has the thought of, oh, I was right, the necklaces don't pull you back, and then she turns off to set off on her journey, and that's the beginning of part 2. I want to pause here because, in my opinion, Part 1 is perfect. No notes. I wouldn't change anything about it. It was so intriguing. And if you follow me on Instagram, then you know I finished part 1 at like 9:30 p.m. It was such a perfect stopping place that the adult in me was like, I should go to bed. I'll just finish it tomorrow, whatever. But I was so hooked. I was so attached to Greer and Ellis. I was obsessed with them as a couple. I really liked Greer as a character. Her superhuman hearing and the screech ability was so cool to me. I was so intrigued by the bright eyes. I wanted to know what they were. I was pretty convinced at that point that the benevolence didn't exist. Obviously want the confirmation of that and want to see why that is. And is it the bright eyes that they just make deals with, or is there something else going on? Everything about it, the delivery of it was so cool. I really felt like the author was allowing you to draw conclusions from things. Nothing felt over-explained. I didn't feel like things were getting dumbed down for me. And I was especially impressed with that, knowing that this is this author's first adult novel, and she typically writes young adult, in which case there typically has a little bit more explaining in it, although I do think that a common mistake in young adult is over explaining. So it made me want to read some of her young adult and see if she finds her way around that, because I do think she did a really good job of not over explaining things in this first part. And really everything was so ambiguous, and there was this amazing mystery, and you wanted to know, you wanted to figure it out. Where was Ellis going? Why did he leave? What's going on with the town? What are these monsters? What's up with Greer? Like, everything about it, I was hooked. It had its claws in me. And the second I finished work the next day, I was sat with that book to finish it. And part 2 did not go anywhere that I was expecting it to, and not always in a way that was fun. Because being surprised by a book can be really fun. And some of the surprises were fun. Some of them were a little bit like, ooh, I don't know about that. But in order to understand why that is, we have to walk through the plot of part 2. Greer is following Ellis's path, but he has a full day's head start on her. It's really easy to follow his path because it's not like he was trying to hide it for any reason. So she ends up finding the campsite where he camped for the first night that he was traveling. And when she lays down to go to sleep, she finds a note from him. And the note says that he knows that she's going to go looking for him, and that he chose to leave voluntarily, and that he loves her, and that he wants what's best for her. And so he wants her to turn around, go back to the town, and forget he ever existed and live the rest of her life happy. But she, of course, is like, I can't be happy without Ellis. I have to find him. All of this stuff that's been built up about Greer was really coming to fruition. She had a map that she was trying to follow, although she didn't exactly know where. I think the map was actually the note that Ellis maybe wrote to her was on the map. His tracks get covered by the snow, so she can't follow his tracks anymore, but she assumes he would have gone to the river to make sure he had fresh water on his journey, and she can hear the river from really far away. And she has this map, and she thinks it's a certain distance, but then as she's walking, she would have expected to hit it by now, and she's realizing that she hasn't. And because of her superhuman hearing, she can hear it clearly, so hearing isn't really an indication to her about how far away it is. So she ends up climbing up on this thing to see where the mountain is and how far away it is from her and where that landmark is on the map, and basically is using that to figure out what's wrong with the map. And all of that was super fun, right? We're using all of this stuff that's been set up about Greer to show her on this wilderness journey trying to find the love of her life. And then this guy finds her. She's sitting on top of this thing, and this guy finds her. Not Ellis, okay? This is another name that I've unfortunately forgotten since giving the book to my mom, and I don't want to ask her to check because the reveal of this man is a spoiler. I'm pretty sure his name is Noah, but don't quote me on that. It might be a different short N name, but it is a short male name that starts with N. I'm pretty sure it's Noah. He comes out of the woods, and he kind of surprises her. and she falls off this thing. And then she wakes up and he's been helping her. And it's immediately clear to the reader that he is a bright-eyed. Actually, wait, pause. I believe that right before this happens, she actually has a run-in with another bright-eyed in its more bright-eyed form. That freaks her out too, and it knows her by name, and it's like talking to her, and that's kind of weird. And then there's this whole thing with her climbing the thing and this person coming out of the woods. So when she comes to and Noah is helping her, it becomes very clear to the reader very quickly that he is also a bright-eyed. So this is all building the intrigue, right? Why did this one bright-eyed know her by name? Why is this other one helping her when she seemingly got injured? What is going on here? However, unfortunately, this moment is where the book starts to go off the rails. He appears, he helps her, then he disappears. And she assumes that he's eaten by a bright-eyed, but the reader has already assumed that he is one. And as she continues her journey, she just continues to like almost die in these like really stupid ways. And he ends up saving her again. And this time he gives her something to drink that makes her feel better. But she looks at her own reflection and realizes that as a result, her eyes are glowing the way that the bright-eyeds do. And some of this other stuff that makes her think like, wait a minute, whatever I drank made me feel way better. But I seem to be transforming into a bright-eyed. What is going on? He comes back to camp. She confronts him about this. And partially here and partially over the course of the next few scenes with the two of them, he just explains to her the answers to the whole entire mystery, just right then. And we've still got easily 30-40% of the book left. So what's the rest of this book gonna be? Because I figured that the rest of the book was gonna be us figuring this stuff out, but he just basically explains to her what the bright-eyeds are and how she plays into all of it. Over the course of the next few scenes that we get pretty much all the information there is to have about that whole mystery. And this is where I really want to dive into what I meant about the risk of fusing genres, because genres are a suggestion, right? But they also are typically somewhat formulaic. I don't at all want to say that you have to stick to the formula. Breaking the formula is great. It can be very unique. It can be very interesting. However, if you're going to break the formula, you need to understand why the formula was there. Because if you don't know why the formula is that way, then you run the risk of what I think happened with this book exactly, which is that what was intriguing about it and what was interesting about it was the mystery. Yes, I cared that Greer found Ellis, but I honestly cared a little bit more to understand what was going on. In a mystery, the climax is the solving of the mystery, and in a romance, the climax is the reuniting of the couple or the solving of whatever it is that was in the way of them being a couple. And so you would presume, if this book is following the formula of a mystery and a romance, that the mystery would be solved and the couple would be brought back together at the same time in the climax. However, it's clear to me that the author wasn't thinking of it that way, but that was what was intriguing to me about the book. So to have the mystery solved so early and to have so much of the book to go, I was like, wait a minute, what's the rest of this book going to be then? And the answer is that it's a fantasy action fighting sort of sequence climax, which was such a whiplash because that's just not what the book was up to that point. And so I'm not saying that it's impossible to solve the mystery early in a mystery and still have it be a good book, especially because you're fusing genres, but it didn't really feel like the genres were fused as much as it felt like it took a really hard shift. But it really did feel to me like there was a very distinct point where the mystery got solved and then it wasn't a mystery anymore. And now it's a fantasy romance. And you're just like, what? And not only that, but Noah ends up becoming the third of a love triangle. When Noah gets introduced, Greer has this weird attraction to him. In the scene where Noah solves the mystery for Greer, he also reveals that he was always sort of intended to be her partner, and it is the kickoff of a love triangle. Obviously, I will explain that more in depth in a second, but just bear with me. So then we end up with a love triangle, where it's her and Ellis and Noah. The first, I would say 60 to 65% of this book are a mystery romance. And then there is a hard switch into a fantasy romance with a love triangle. And it's a whiplash. And everything about the book is different from that point out. I genuinely would not be surprised to find out either that there was originally a completely different ending to this book that she rewrote either from feedback or because she wanted to, she being the author, or the opposite, that she had written some other plot leading into this ending and then had to change the beginning, because I don't know how this happens accidentally. I don't really understand how we went from what what the beginning of the book was to what the ending of it was in a way that almost made me hesitant to recommend it, even though I enjoyed my read so much, because I don't know who to recommend this book to. I don't know who to tell to read it. But also, Greer's mapping ability and her superhuman hearing almost have nothing to do with the rest of the narrative. So all of this in-depth, thought out stuff that we got about Greer and her character, and all of these things that were really fun about her, and all of these things that made her great for this whole story of her wandering through the woods, just kind of flies out the window. And Noah basically takes care of getting them to the location where Ellis is and where the final showdown happens. And also, like, this isn't the only info dump scene with him. Like, as the scenes go, he keeps info dumping on her to explain stuff. And it was so confusing. I didn't understand how the beginning of this book was written by the same author that wrote the ending, because so much of this book was such a masterclass in planting information and making things clear without explaining it in so many words. It was genuinely like something that I thought I would point to for you guys to be like, hey, if you want to see an example of an author not over explaining a narrative, check this book out. But I cannot say that about this book, because there reaches a point where there's just the character that knows everything, that knows the answer, that just gives Greer the answer. And then the rest of the book is not just over explained, but Greer herself as a character is completely different. She feels like an entirely different person. And the events that happen from that point out are just like odd. And I really wish that the author had stuck to this being a mystery romance with these fantastical elements, and that we'd gotten the reveal of the mystery as the climax, and that there hadn't been combat at all. I actually think a lack of combat would have really worked for this book, and I think it would have been really cool. But with all of that preamble, let me tell you what the plot twist is. So Greer sees that she has started to transform into a bright-eyed, and she's like, what the hell? What did you do to me, Noah? And he just sits her down to explain that her mother was a bright-eyed, and that she was actually their queen, and that the way that their species works, when the queen dies, somebody else takes over, and when they take over her power. And she knew that one of their members of their coven, Elwyn, probably would have been the one to take over after her, and Elwyn is crazy. And so she didn't really want Elwyn to take over after she wasn't queen anymore, so she shed her powers into this cloak. They can shapeshift into a humanoid shape, but she had to shed her powers to be able to go past the warding stones, because the warding stones really do keep the bright-eyeds away, with the intention of Greer growing up to become a bright-eyed and take over as their queen. And that because she was half human, that was actually going to make her already stronger than a lot of the other bright-eyeds. And then once her mother dies, she would be able to take her mother's powers over, and that would make her even more powerful. Greer just finds out from Noah. Not only that, but Greer's mom had always intended for Noah to be her consort, is what they called it, and that he would be her partner and her protector once she joined their group and became a bright-eyed, and that she actually was very distraught when Greer and Ellis kind of had a lifelong romance sort of situation. They met when they were very young, obviously, because it's a very small town, and they fell in love at the age of like 10 or 11. And so her mom was very distraught to see Greer paying so much attention to this boy in town, because she was worried that that was going to wreck the whole plan, and that Greer was not going to want to leave the town because she was in love with this man. But then she felt like Greer was too young and wasn't strong enough to be introduced to all of the bright-eyed stuff, and so she tried to stick it out anyway, and eventually Greer's dad figured out what her mom was. This I don't think is revealed in this scene exactly, but I'm just kind of going to tell you all of it, where at one point Greer's dad figures out what Greer's mom is and kills her as a result. But you might be wondering, well, what are the bright-eyeds? Because that's part of what was fun about this whole thing, is that there's this new monster, and they're super unique and interesting, and we don't really have a clear-cut description of them. I am so sorry to inform you that they're vampires. I know, take it in, let it sit a second. They never use the word vampire, but when they do give a full description of the bright-eyeds, how they're made, drinking blood and then giving blood, and the description of them, they're very old style vampires with the bat ears and the bat wings and the weird legs and being very like creepy and almost like half bat looking, but they can morph into humans. So again, the author chose never to use the word vampire and just to make it really clear that they are this ancient traditional definition of a vampire sort of creature. The reveal that this had been a vampire story all along, I have thought about this so much since I read this book. I genuinely think that if the mystery plotline had played out better and if the reveal of it had been more satisfying, I maybe would have thought it was kind of cool that the monsters were vampires because it would have been such a unique take on a vampire story. The fact that all of this was just dropped on you and the beginning of this book was so intriguing and so interesting and so cool and you're hooked the whole time and it's so unique and it's a hard to describe book and you're just along for the ride and you're enjoying it so much and there's all this intrigue and all this mystery and it's so unique, only for it to turn out to be a vampire romance with a love triangle. It was just such a plot twist, and I genuinely don't know if it was kind of like because of the way it was delivered, but what I do know is that the way it played out, I remember getting to that and being like, excuse me? What? Like, no, I don't want this to be a vampire romance. I wanted a new monster. I've read so much vampire romance and I love vampire romance, but like, I want a new monster. Is that so much to ask? Like, you made me so creeped out by these things and you made me so intrigued by them, and I don't know, I kind of just wanted a new monster. So when Noah has Greer drink his blood, this starts the transformation to turn her into a full bright-eyed. And he tells her that they need her mom's cloak, which is what she put all of her powers into. And Greer's like, oh, I have no idea where that is. My dad told me it was lost a while back, so I have no idea where it is. And Noah's like, oh, that's okay. I think you'll still be powerful enough once we transform you to defeat Elwyn. And Greer's like, buddy, I don't want that. I just want to find Ellis, and we're going to use these necklaces that keep us away from the warding stones to run off and be together. Noah's like, no, this is your destiny. And what plays out from that point on is a bunch of plot that truly does not matter, and I don't even want to bother explaining it to you, but they end up getting to the mine where all the other vampires are. Over the course of these pages, this book started to build a potential to redeem itself, because now we were starting to see Greer grapple, not only with the fact that her father wasn't who she thought he was, because she's already kind of dealing at that point in time with the fact that her father was sending these people to their deaths, but then to find out that her mother was a literal, genuine, out of a storybook monster, and that she was born half monster, and that her mother had every intention of her becoming a full-blown monster. And not only that, but that the Bright-Eyeds can survive on animals, so why was her mom killing humans? All of this led to what could have been a very interesting emotional journey in Greer. And when they get outside of the mine and her dad shows up, this was when I was like, oh wow, we have a real opportunity to explore this now. We have an opportunity for Greer to grapple with the fact that her father literally, like, what a perfect metaphor, was bedding a monster, like got in bed with a monster. He didn't know she was a monster at the time, but he was obviously sending a lot of these teens to their death. At this point in time, it's the reader's understanding that all of the people who had run off during the hunt were actually doing it to be these sacrifices. Her father was sending people to their deaths and knew he was doing that. Also that her father killed her mother, and also that her mother was a monster, but her father loves her enough to have hunted her down and wants her to come back to Mistaken and forget all of this and just live her life as a human and leave Ellis be. It was this real opportunity for Greer to grapple with her father as a complicated human being and her mother as a complicated, I guess not human, but being, and then herself as a complicated being as a result. And, you know, a lot of people have had this experience of growing up and realizing their parents who weren't who they thought they were, or even that aspects of their birth and how they came to be weren't the way that they thought it was, and how much that can mess with a person, and the understanding of the self that can happen when that happens. But instead of exploring any of that, her dad just gets killed. Like, he shows up, he explains the last little bit of the information they didn't know, and he has a backpack with him that just happens to have Greer's mom's cloak in it, and then he gets killed by Elwyn, and that's it. And it's so sudden. At that point in time when her dad dies, she realizes how monstrous these creatures really are, and decides that what she's actually going to do is kill all of them. and that this is going to be a suicide mission. And one of two things could have played out, and I still would have been okay with it. She could have either never put the cloak on and figured out a way out of this without having put the cloak on. She could have put the cloak on and come to terms with the fact that she was this monster, right? And it could have become a metaphor for the parts of ourselves that we don't really want to look at or want to see, and the more like monstrous parts of ourselves as humans. She's worried about Ellis accepting her even as a half bright-eyed, let alone as a full. There was this opportunity to explore her accepting herself and also Ellis accepting her. Instead of any of that, she ends up putting on the cloak, becoming a bright-eyed, and then genuinely a chapter or two later, all of the vampires in this coven attack her and start sucking the magic out of her before she can even really use it, and she essentially transforms back into a half bright-eyed as a result. It was such a half-baked plot point. It was the first point in the book that I was genuinely mad, because as much as I'm talking shit about it, I do just want to stress that at this point in time, I was still kind of enjoying the read. I was a little bit disappointed by the early mystery reveal, and I was also disappointed by the reveal that the monsters were vampires. And I still wanted to see how everything played out and what she ended up doing and which of the boys does she end up with. And so I was still hooked. But when she put the cloak on, became a bright-eyed, and I'm not joking, it could not have been more than 2 chapters later, had all that magic sucked out of her and just transforms back into half human, like whatever she was before, that still had this hearing and this screech ability, but nothing else. That's so cheap. That's such a cheat in every way, shape, or form. Like, why have her put the cloak on at that point? Like, just take that plot point out and have her never put the cloak on. Like, I don't really understand why it's like she puts the cloak on, becomes a vampire, then essentially has the vampireness sucked out of her. Like, why? Even after she has all of the vampireness and her mom's magic sucked out of her by everybody, she manages to escape. Noah saves her, I'm pretty sure. By the way, Ellis just got like kind of removed from this whole thing. So they found him, they saved him, and now they're figuring out what they're doing with the coven sort of thing. So he's just kind of somewhere else. She is trying to get away, and she's trying to help Noah get away too. The mountain is an iron mine, and the vampires are averse to iron. And at some point she realizes, she's like, well, why would they settle here if there's all this iron in the mountain? And even Noah doesn't really have a great explanation for her. It's a little bit convenient, but whatever. And then Noah is killed somewhat suddenly and brutally as well. And so she just lets out like the loudest scream that she can to essentially crash the mine down on all of the vampires and kill all of them, including herself. And again, her goal here is to kill everybody. However, for some reason that isn't explained by her and isn't really explained in the narrative at all, the mountain doesn't collapse on her. Like, she manages to remove herself from the collapse of the mountain with her scream. If this book had kept up with the implications of things, not fully explaining everything sort of vibe, then I maybe could have forgiven that. But how annoying that we got such clear-cut explanations and such mundane explanations for all of what was unique in the mystery, only to have there be this open-ended, like, how did she get out of the mountain? Nobody knows, not even Greer. We're just gonna move on now. It was just so convenient. And really, that's the big word that I feel like I have for a lot of the plot at the end of this book, was just convenient. Her dad showing up with the cloak, the vampires living in an iron mine when iron is this metal that's dangerous to them and can kill them. Even honestly, Noah finding her and being destined to be her consort or whatever, and everything to do with that. Like, it was just so convenient. I would not be shocked to hear that this book was written by 2 different authors, and one of them took the first 65 to 70% and the other took the back third. Like, if I found that out, I feel like that would make more sense than the book that I read. It genuinely felt like 2 different books. Oh, I forgot to mention that at some point in these pages, it's either Noah or her dad who tells her that the warding stones weren't put there by the benevolence. The benevolence doesn't exist. That was kind of obvious at this point, but they weren't put there by the bright-eyeds either. The guy who started the town actually knew some magic himself and tried to cast a spell to keep away the bright-eyeds, and he just messed it up. And so he ended up accidentally trapping anybody there who stayed overnight, but that wasn't intentional and that wasn't necessary for the protection spell. That in and of itself is kind of fun. I like the idea that the reveal for the explanation as to why the warding stones are the way that they are is just this guy kind of messed up the spell. Like, that is a little bit fun, but that was the only real fun plot twist I felt like in the whole book. Everything else just felt really flat for me. And again, that is just explained to her. Why did we start just explaining everything? We weren't doing that up to this point. She's able to scream really loud and just like destroy the warding stones and free the town so nobody's stuck there anymore. And she's killed all the Bright-Eyes, so now nobody has to be worried about that anymore. The book ends with her and Ellis on a boat traveling to go wander because that's what she's always wanted. But then there is a Bright-Eyed flying above the boat. And so there is a little bit of like a cliffhanger-y kind of ending, but you know it's a standalone. But it is just kind of like, oh, the Bright-Eyes weren't actually wiped out. At least one of them survived. And then the book ends. So what were my overarching thoughts? Oh, there's Stanley. Can you see him? So you might be wondering, Meredith, you just complained about this book for like, I don't even know how long the edit's going to be. Why did you give it 5 stars? That's really confusing. And the answer is I don't know. The ratings are really subjective, and I try to stay true to the rating I gave a book when I finished it. I rarely change ratings because I really do feel like how I felt about a book when I finished it is the truest to what my reading experience was. And just because I'm a giant book nerd who dwells on the books that I read and thinks about them way too much after I'm finished with them, doesn't mean that that's how everybody is. And when I finished this book and put it down, it felt like a 5 stars to me. The beginning was so good that I couldn't, in my heart of hearts, give it a 4 or a 3. Like it had to be a 5 because of how good the first part was. But then I guess that makes it a really big letdown because I really did not like how the ending played out. It was a very fun read for me, and I did very much enjoy the read, even as the choices were confusing me. And it wasn't until I thought about it afterwards that I really got disappointed by it, because I was like, I feel like there was just such an opportunity here for it to be a staple, like on my Mount Rushmore of favorite books of all time. And the ending was so weird and convoluted that it didn't become that. The bar was set so high by part 1 that part 2 falling flat doesn't mean that part 2 was bad. It just means that it didn't match up to what part 1 was, just because of how good it was. If I gave it the rating now, I maybe would give it a 4, but again, I try to stay true to the ratings that I give a book right when I finish it, because I feel like that's the truest to my opinion of it. Given too much time to dwell, I can find a problem with anything. I just got obsessed with figuring out where the book went wrong and why the ending felt a little bit disappointing for me. And it was in dwelling on that I was like, oh, I actually feel like I don't like some of the choices made in the back half of this book. I still would recommend reading it. It was really cool. And especially if you're writing your own book, I really do think the first 150 pages at least are a masterclass in introducing information and not over explaining it. I thought that part of it was so good. But I want to finish out the video by going back to what I said about genre fusion being a blessing and a curse. What did I mean by that specifically? I really think the problem with this book is that it didn't know what it wanted to be. I know what I would have wanted it to be. That doesn't mean that's what the author would have wanted it to be. The book was not cohesive. The first part was a mystery romance and the second part was a fantasy romance. So the readers you're going to pull in with that beginning are not the readers that are going to be satisfied by that ending. Really, the only choice that I thought was like bad or made me roll my eyes was everything to do with the cloak. If the cloak hadn't been in there, and honestly, if Noah hadn't been in there, like I probably would have thought it was a much better book, but say she doesn't want to scrap Noah entirely, I honestly think that without the cloak, so much of this book would have been so much better. If it was just a matter of her being her mother's daughter and being that powerful as a result and being half bright-eyed, half human, and that giving her some advantage over the other bright-eyeds. And I think that if it had just been that and everything to do with the cloak just wasn't in there, because then we wouldn't have had her dad showing up conveniently with the cloak, and we also wouldn't have had all of the crazy stuff with her not putting the cloak on and being in all this danger but refusing to put the cloak on and then putting it on and only having it on for like 20 seconds and then immediately having all the magic sucked out of her. Even just that, I think, would have fixed so much of the problems with the ending. I think the mistake was not staying true to what the beginning of the book was. And again, I would not be surprised if one or the other half of this book was the original and the other half she either got a note from the publisher or herself decided to rewrite, but then didn't rewrite the other half when she did that. When Noah explains to her what the Bright-Eyes are, the book completely changes. And so it isn't really a fusion of mystery and fantasy and romance. It's a mystery romance that just switch flips into a fantasy romance, and that makes it jarring. It still got a 5 stars from me, but I think that also makes it one of my biggest disappointments, because if the beginning was that good to the point where even with this ending it gets a 5 stars from me, then imagine what it could have been if she had just followed what she had already set up. It just feels like such a missed opportunity to be genuinely one of the best books I've ever read. But despite all of that, I do still recommend it, and that's because, hey, I'm a complicated human being too, and I can like something and have it not be perfect, and admit there are faults with it and still really, really love it. Anyway, that's gonna be it for me today, you guys. Have you guys read this book? If you have, what did you think of it? Did you pause and come back to the video after you had read it? And if so, what did you think of it? I love you guys, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!